Paul wrote, I pray that you will be active in sharing your faith, so that you will have a full understanding of every good thing we have in Christ Jesus. I'll say it again. I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith, so that you'll have a full understanding of every good thing we have in Christ Jesus. That somehow sharing our faith will lead to levels of maturity and intimacy with Christ that we cannot have any other way. As a matter of fact, the phrase full understanding is one word in the Greek, epigenosko. It's the most intimate word for knowledge in the New Testament. And it's often used to speak of the carnal knowledge between a husband and a wife. That's the level of intimacy. When we share our faith, somehow we get into a deeper relationship with God. So let me put a context to that. I want to pray for us today. Father, I thank you for the privilege of being here. I know I often come, but I know that your Holy Spirit can take those problems and bless them, multiply them, and distribute them in a way that every person will gain something from you tonight. And they would have the affirmation of deeply they're loved by you because of this. So let your Spirit have his way with us, and we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, the context of that verse is Paul was under house arrest in Rome. It was a time when he could have easily been upset about God. He could have said, you know, Lord, I don't get it. I went to Thessalonica, and they say the people have turned the world upside down to come here. He could have said, Lord, when I was in Ephesus, in 2 years teaching in the school of Tyrannus, everybody in Asia Minor heard the gospel. Aren't you wasting a good resource by letting me be here incarcerated in Rome? Mm-hmm. But in Philippians chapter 1, verse 12, he says, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. How can that be? So limited, so constricted. I've had twice men come to me and say, Jerry, you've got to pray for me. I'm the only Christian at my place of work, and I'm miserable. And so in both cases, I put my hand on the man's shoulder, and I said, Lord, look at the misery of my brother, being the only Christian in his place of work. Please, Father, I pray, this day, take him home to heaven. Get him off this earth. In both cases, they knocked my hand off their shoulder and said, what are you praying? I said, well, you can look at yourself as being circumstances that are limiting and miserable. Or you can look at yourself as being in circumstances that are strategic and that God has uniquely placed you there. So it has to do with outlook. Paul, in prison, said, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. He even says, as a matter of fact, my imprisonment's known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard were the Navy SEALs of the ancient Roman Empire. The Green Beret of the ancient Roman Empire. And you could imagine him every day talking to whoever the Praetorian Guard was that was assigned to him. Matter of fact, you can imagine what it was like back at the office. Where one guy says, I don't get this. I've got the Paul assignment today. Do you know anything about that? I was there last week, the other guy says. He says, I think my life's changing because of it. If you don't want it, I'll switch places with you. At the end of Philippians, what does Paul say? The saints in Caesar's household greet you. How is it that he could have his finger on the pulse of the Roman Empire from the constricted circumstances of being in a jail cell in Rome? And I think it's because he said, Lord, I trust you. You put me where you want me, and I'm going to look for the opportunities. I yield myself to you each day to do what you want to do for me. He had time on his hands now, and he was able to put off those letters he hadn't written for a while. So he wrote to the church at Philippi. He wrote to the church at Colossae. He wrote to the church at Ephesus, and he also wrote this letter to his friend Philemon. Philemon was a guy Paul had led to Christ before. And Philemon had a slave named Onesimus who escaped from Philemon, just happened to come to Rome, just happened to come when Paul was under house arrest. Paul just happened to lead him to Christ, just a coincidence, don't let it build your faith at all. And then Paul sends Philemon Onesimus, after he's discipled him, back to Philemon and says, I want you to accept him as a brother. I know this thing can work out. And at the end of Philemon, what does he say? My fellow prisoner, Epaphras, sends his greeting. He also says, so does my co-worker, Mark. Who was Mark? Mark was the guy that was Paul's Onesimus, that left him at Pamphylia on the first missionary journey. He was the guy that Paul and Barnabas broke up their fellowship over. And Barnabas took Mark, and Barnabas discipled Mark like he had discipled Paul. Paul sees what a mistake he made because what an asset Mark had become. Well, anyway, in that context, he writes this thing to Philemon. I pray that you'll be active in sharing your faith, so that you'll have a full understanding of every good thing you have in Christ Jesus. How will you grow if you share your faith? I want to give you at least 3 ways, and if there's 3, there could be 3,000. So let's just stop at 3, and then we'll make some practical applications. Number 1, you'll grow because people will ask you questions you won't know the answer to. So I became a Christian. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. We went to a church. I love the people at that church. They're good-hearted people. But it was an inner-city church. There was one person in the whole church with a college education. They were well-meaning, but there was a lot of misinformation passed around. For example, I heard in a Sunday school class when I was about 8 or 9 years old, if I went to a movie and Jesus came back while I was in the theater, I'd go straight to hell. I really wanted to see Walt Disney's The Shaggy Dog, but didn't know if it was worth risking my eternal destiny to go see. The neighbor lady, Mrs. Greenlee, and I'm not embellishing this at all, it happened just like this. Mrs. Greenlee came down and asked my mom if my brothers and I could go with her boys to see The Shaggy Dog. I'm looking at my mother with ambivalence. I want to go on one hand, I'm scared stiff on the other, and my mom said it would be okay if we went to go to that movie, and I began to wonder if she really loved me, that she would put my life in such a turmoil. And I deduced from this, from hearing in a Sunday school class, if I lived a holy and righteous life all my life, had one bad thought the last second of my life, I'd go straight to hell.
That's what we were taught.
And I deduced as a boy, if I could lose this based on what I did, I had to gain it based on what I did, and I never saw anything with Jesus in that equation. Matter of fact, I was always in trouble. And consequently, I just felt I was destined for hell. So I thought, this is the only window of time I have, and I just thought, I might as well live like I'm going to hell. I didn't get involved in sexual things. There was a girlfriend I had when I was a sophomore in high school. She dumped me for an older guy. He took advantage of her. It messed up her life. I saw what was done, and I thought, it's wrong when guys do this to women. But I also said, you need to understand, I was no paragon of virtue. I was in fights all the time. I used to carry a gun to school. My whole life was a fabric where none of the threads went in the right direction. I was going to church every Sunday, vice president of my youth group, playing football, getting drunk every weekend with my buddies, student body president, carrying a gun and getting in fights. Do any of those work? My frontal lobe wasn't fully developed. And I came home one day and my mother found the gun loaded between the mattresses. She thought it was a starter pistol for track, because they ran track. So she's looking at this gun and pulls the trigger and blows a hole through my mattress, and the bullet lodges on the floor of the house. She calls me up at a friend's house, and I come home and she's weeping. She's convinced her son's going to go to prison. And she's crying, and she's telling me all of her concerns, and she hands the gun back to me. Would you give the gun back to your 17-year-old son? She was just so off balance at that particular moment, but it cut me to the quick. Because I realized the life I was living was just hurting me and hurting the people who cared for me. And I went to college in total existential despair. I couldn't live a good enough life to go to heaven, and I was miserable living the kind of life I was living. My older brother was a Christian, so when I got to college, he invited me to a Campus Crusade for Christ meeting. And for the first time, I heard that God loved me, and He forgave me. And He would enter my life as Lord to bring order out of chaos. And I have never stopped being grateful. I'm still overwhelmed by the message. My need for Jesus isn't casual. It's constant. And out of that, I thought, everybody will want to know this. And I started sharing Christ with people. And I started finding, this happened, I think God sometimes, there's a line from Trollope's Barchester Towers, that God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. And I think when there's a new believer, that sometimes God gives us a little nudging by giving us a little bit of extra. And maybe when we get older, he's trying to give us a little extra by building us character, so we'll be enduring whether we get the little extra pennies or not. And I remember that first week I was a Christian. I was in my dorm, and I saw 3 guys in the hall, and I said, hey, you guys, I got to tell you something. This is just amazing. And they came in my dorm, and I said, I went to a meeting the other night, and these people were different. And I saw something different in them, and they told me that God loved me. They told me that God forgave me of my sins. And I think you guys would like to know about it. And I don't know what else to say, because that's all I know. And I said, Lord, I want to pray. I said, Lord, please help these guys find out how much you love them and forgive them. Amen. Knock on the door. As soon as I said amen, these guys' eyes got big as saucers. I go to the door. It's 3 Campus Crusade for Christ guys coming to follow me up. They saw I was sharing Jesus with 3 guys in the dorm. Their eyes got big as saucers. One guy pulled me out into the hall to try and help me have a little upgrade in my content. And 2 of those 3 guys asked Jesus in their heart. And I said, this is too good. So I made it my goal to share Christ with every guy I played football with in college. Every year. So we saw about 15 guys a year come to faith, about 60 in all, I think, from the time I was there. And I didn't know jack squat, you know. And I'd share Christ with my friends, and they would ask me questions. If God's good and all-powerful, why does evil exist in the universe? I'm embarrassed to say I never once had that idea cross my mind before I became a Christian. I've since written a book on it. It matters to me. But when my friends would ask me, I'd say, that's a really good question. I have no clue about the answer, but I'll get back to you. Questions never have to stop the discussion. Even the ones you don't know the answer to. You go dig for answers. You're never going to get, I've read about 600 books on that problem of evil issue. I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. But we can get a substantive sure word, even if we don't get a last word. We can know truths. We can know a sure word about truth that should give you confidence when you share. Because you don't know the nth degree of this thing, that should give you the sure word with an open hand, and you talk about it with humility. Because you don't know all the answers. And so I would go share the answers that I would get, and sometimes the guys would respond, and they would trust Christ. I would go back to them and I'd say, remember the other day when you asked me that question? Well, yeah. I said, you mattered to me. I took your question seriously. I've been digging. This is what I've been finding. You might be interested in this. And sometimes they came to faith. Sometimes they just asked another question. How do we know the Bible is really God's Word? What about Jesus saying He's the only way? What about other religions? What about X, Y, and Z? And you start digging for answers, and pretty soon 2 things happen. One, you start recognizing that the questions that are asked, you've been fortified for the answers because you've been doing this for a while. The second thing you find is this faith is really way more intriguing than you ever first imagined, because there's answers to these questions. And so, and another thing you get to, you learn not to be afraid of questions. If you have no doubts about your faith, about anything related to your faith, you are delusional, because you think you've achieved omniscience. There's a lot of things we don't know. We're pea-brains trying to understand the infinite God of the universe. Remember when Lucy sees Aslan for the first time and she goes back and encounters that Christ figure, the Lion of Narnia? She says to him, Aslan, you're bigger. He says, no, child, I'm not, but every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. Put yourself in a situation where you're sharing your faith and you keep finding God bigger and bigger. And it's so much fun. Second way you'll grow, not only because people will ask you questions, they'll scrutinize your life. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. If you're not examining your own life, I guarantee you the people around you will be happy to do it for you. I knew a man once who said, I would never put a Christian bumper sticker on my car. If I did that, I'd have to drive better. And if you share your faith, people want to know, are you the real deal or not? I lived a wild life before I became a Christian. And now I'm a Christian and I'm sharing Christ with my fraternity brothers and the guys on the football team. And they're looking at my life and they're saying, we have no clue how you can call yourself a Christian. You say this, but you're doing this. And I'm going, oh, wow, they're right. This thing's got to seep a little deeper in my life. And I had to confess it to them that I was wrong. I turned them off. You know know what? 3 of those guys came to Christ before I graduated because they saw I took their word seriously. I think that it demonstrates that we're secure enough in the love of Jesus that we can look honestly at our life, and where it's screwed up, we can be grateful for any source that points that out to us, because we want to grow and get better. And people scrutinize your life. And that's not a bad thing. Third, we'll grow because we'll keep seeing Jesus show up. Matter of fact, I'll put it a little bit different way. I don't think we take Jesus to anybody. I think that Jesus is already there because he loves those people more than you and I ever will. So we go to make explicit what God might be already doing implicitly in their life. I wrote a book years ago called The Sacrament of Evangelism. And the idea of in sacramental theology, people believe that God somehow manifests himself uniquely in the sacraments and he mediates grace through those. Well, I believe that if you go to share your faith, you see God already showing up. So in some senses in evangelism, he's manifesting his presence and he's mediating grace through those events. In fact, there was a student of mine, his name was John Hill, and he went and took a church to pastor in Indiana, in a small rural farm town in Indiana. It was a church of about 250 people. He called me up one time and he said, I saw that you took the class I took on evangelism and you turned it into a book. I bought a copy and gave it to my wife. She took the book, read it, applied it, and in 2 years she led 50 people to Jesus who are now part of our church. Now, I think she has the gift. I think she's unique. Don't compare yourself with her. But nevertheless, he said, we started applying things in the book, and our church is 2,000 now. And it's not 2,000 by big events. It's 2,000 by every Christian saying, I can do this. And one-on-one conversion growth in that church is occurring. I don't think this is an impossible expectation. You could get a college education in 4 years. If every person in the church said, Lord, I think I'm capable of leading one person to Christ every 4 years, that would be a 25% growth, of conversion growth in the church every year. If you had attrition of 50%, it would be a 12.5% growth in the church every year. You could do it in 2 years. It would be a 50% growth. If there was attrition by 50%, it would be a 25% growth. Is it impossible for each of us to lead one person to Christ every year? I don't think it's difficult. I don't think we'll all lead people to Christ at the same level. But I do think that there should be some progress in this area in every believer's heart, not because they feel guilty, not because they feel coerced, but because they're learning from their mistakes. They're not letting that stop them from the mission, and they're becoming more proficient at this. I'll give you an example. When I was in college, there was an electrician at my college, and he went to my church. My college was a very secular college. It was a college where if you watched Walter Cronkite in those days, you saw my college on your television with some frequency. I went to Whittier College, which was a college where Richard Nixon attended. And we had Jane Fonda the week after she got back from Hanoi on our free speech platform. We had Daniel Ellsberg the week after he stole the Pentagon Papers. Always we had people like this. CBS, ABC, and NBC were on campus. Protests, riots, and all that sort of thing were going on. And it was a hotbed of protest. You'd usually see Berkeley more than us. And then you'd see Vietnam, and then you'd get Whittier. And interestingly enough, there was this electrician on campus who went to my church, and he was like a breath of fresh air for me to see, an oasis on that campus. But he was angry. And he talked about the fact that he didn't like having to work at a college as an electrician with other people who were so secular. They cussed a lot, they drank a lot, and they would make fun of him. And he would get angry at them. And one day, he threw a punch at one of the guys. And I just thought, I don't know if that's the way to do it. And I watched him. And he eventually had to leave that job because he was a hothead and he didn't share Christ in a way that matched the message of the gospel of the love of God. So I learned from that. That next summer, I had to earn my own way through college, and I got a job working pipeline construction. 135-pound jackhammer, working in the streets of LA, replacing gas pipe, and I get a job with this construction crew. And when these guys found out I was in college and I wasn't shacking up and I wasn't drinking and I wasn't partying and stuff like that, because that part changed in my life. They just started making fun of me. And every day I go to work, they were teasing me, they were making jokes at my expense, and I remembered that guy. I'm learning. We're picking up from these things. We're gaining experience. And what ended up happening was I just didn't respond to this. And if they told a joke at my expense and it was funny, I laughed at it and worked like a dog. And I just worked harder and harder, never pushed back. In 2 weeks, I was one of them. These were my buddies. And I fell in love with them. I started praying for them every day. And I had different times to talk to different ones in the work week. And then at the end of the summer, I said to those guys, you know, I've got to go back to college for football practice in another week. What would I have to do the last day of work to share Jesus with you guys? They said, Jerry, you bring a case of beer, you can talk to us as long as you want. Well, I was too young to buy the beer, and I didn't know if that was the right thing to do or not, but I got my roommate to buy the beer, and they each divided up the cans and put one can each in the cooler on the truck. When the day of work was over, they each reached in that cooler, pulled out one can, popped the can, laid out on the grass, and said, Jerry, you can talk to us about Jesus as long as you want. And I was able to share the gospel. I kept my union dues up that whole year, and I was going to go back the next year. And that company went belly up, and all those guys went to other companies, and I couldn't get on a job. There was a glut of workers. I get a phone call from the YMCA. The YMCA said the guy that was going to direct our summer day camp, and the guy that was going to direct our summer residential camp in the mountains, he just told us he's not going to do this. Would you be willing to direct the Y camp for me? I had been involved in Y growing up. And I said, yeah. You know, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I said, yeah. But when I got there, I said, here's the deal. You've got your day camp, and the last night they sleep over in the park, and then have a hot dog barbecue, and then they have a weenie roast, and then they have a pancake breakfast in the morning. When they do the campfire in the park before they go to sleep, I want to be able to share the gospel story. When they have their story time, I want to tell them about David and Goliath and Queen Esther. And so on. Kids love those stories. And then when we do the residential camp in the mountain, every night at the campfire, I want Bible stories. And the last night, I want to share the gospel. Well, the directors at the YMCA said, well, nobody could complain. It does say Young Men's Christian Association. It's not like they can't say they didn't see it coming. They said, you can do it, but you can't follow them up. I wouldn't have been able to follow up people at that place in my life anyway. And so I did it. We saw about 560 kids come to faith that summer. I don't have the gift of evangelism, but there were these opportunities that were there when I kept my head on the swivel and watched for them. But what happened to those kids? I would pray for them. I'd be up late at night sometimes saying, Lord, I couldn't follow them up. They're yours. Please watch over them. Fast forward years later, I was a youth pastor in Southern California in the suburbs. And one day in my youth group, we had a robust youth group going, and this one guy comes to the youth group, and I said, you know, you look new to me. I don't think I've ever seen you before. He says, I'm not. I am new. Guys at school were Christians, and I asked them where they went to church. We just moved into the area. We were looking for a church. I thought I'd come to the youth group. I said, what's your name? He said, Mike. I said, Mike, are you a believer? Are you a Christian? He says, I am. I said, tell me your story. How'd you come to faith? He said, well, you know, when I was a boy, I went to a YMCA camp up in the mountains. He said, our family was going to leave on family vacation the next day, and my dad wanted to leave before the buses would get home, so he came up the night before, and we left at dark 30, Saturday morning, long before the buses went back. And that night, the director of the camp, I don't even remember his name, he shared the gospel. And my dad and I both trusted Christ. And we went home, we went on vacation. We started going to church. It wasn't long after that my mom and my two sisters came to faith. And we just moved to the suburbs here, and I'm looking for a church. I said, Mike, what was the name of that YMCA camp? He said, Little Green Valley YMCA camp. I said, what was the name of the YMCA you went up there with? He said, the Southeast YMCA in Huntington Park, California. I said, Mike, I was the director of that camp. And we worshiped Jesus. Because he let us see that he was faithful. He wants us to be faithful. And he wants us to trust that even if we don't always see how it works out, he's still involved in that process. And when he gave me that window to see what he had done with one, I was just overwhelmed. My faith started to grow even more. So let's look at some practical ways we can do this. I'm a bit of an extrovert, but maybe you're an introvert. And if you're an introvert, I want to share with you a way you can share your faith. It's so easy. Pray. Pray. Pray for specific people in your world that you have contact with. I don't mean pray for Aunt Gertrude in Freeport, Maine. Go ahead and pray for her too. But I'm talking about people that you have regular contact with. You know, it's funny because we have to open our eyes. I've got meeting students, they say, I want to do Muslim evangelism one day. But I'm stuck here on this Christian campus, and I just don't have opportunity. I say to them, do you have a car? They say, yeah. I say, does it run on water? I said, no, it runs on gas. I said, where do you get the gas? All the gas station owners around us pretty much are Pakistanis. And I say, do you pay at the pump, or do you go inside and pay inside? If it's not out of your way, you're getting gas anyway. Go to the same gas station all the time. Go and pay at the counter. Get to know the names of the people. Start praying for them by name. And in fact, take them cookies sometime. They'll never forget your name after that. And watch where that goes. So anyway, I think that these opportunities, they come up constantly, and I think you can start praying for people. Works maybe like this. There was a guy, his name was Brad. I used to live in Santa Barbara, California. If you believe in Jesus when you die, if you don't go to Seattle, you go to Santa Barbara. And this guy had a sports bar and grill. And it was called Duffy Doherty's. He was a Michigan State grad, and he had been an NFL football player years ago. And so I started going to the sports bar and grill. I did 4 working lunches a week. I would always go to the same restaurant. You get tired of the food after a while, but you're not there for the food. God wants us to plant his flag in the world. None of us can plant it everywhere, but all of us can plant it somewhere. So I started going there, and I had met Brad a little bit before the restaurant opened up, and I'd already put him on my list, and I was praying for Brad every day. So every day I would go there, I would try and have some face-to-face contact. Boy, Brad, I hope business is going well. Brad, I love the mahi-mahi sandwich. I hope you keep it on the menu. Hey, Brad, did you catch the game last night? 3 weeks, small talk every time I was in there. And after 3 weeks, I said to him, you know what, Brad? I pray for you every day. I've never said that to a person and had them say back to me, well, would you stop it? You won't move somebody's praying for. That's as aggressive as I got in my evangelism with Brad, was letting him know I was praying for him every 3 weeks. Next 3 weeks, small talks. Every time I saw him, small talk. 3 weeks later, I said, Brad, you know what? I pray for you every day. He said, you know, you said that a few weeks ago. I didn't really believe you, but if you're saying it again, you must really be praying for me. I said, I never miss. I'm praying for you every day. He said to me, Jerry, would you pray for my boys too? I wrote down the names of his boys. I went home that night and told my family, Brad asked me to pray for his boys. My daughter said, Dad, I know his one son. He goes to my school. I wish you could have been there 5 months later when my daughter came home from youth group to say, one of the guys in the youth group brought Brad's son to the youth group, and that night he gave his heart to Jesus. My kids know God answers these prayers. But with Brad, he wasn't the only guy I was doing this with. He was just one. There's a lot of people in our world we could be doing this with at the same time. But Brad was one. In the restaurant, there was one of the waitresses I was able to lead to Christ after a time. I was there with my best friend one time. We were having lunch. And there was a guy that he knew sitting in another booth by himself. We invited him over. We had a conversation. And over that lunch, he trusted Christ. But Brad was just slow going. But every 3 weeks, I'd say to him, Brad, I pray for you every day. About 9 months into it, he came up to me and he said, Jerry, I want to see you after lunch. Is that okay? He was a big guy, former NFL football player. I said, sure, Brad. I called my secretary, changed my appointment this afternoon. We went down to a coffee shop, and he pours out his life to me. Why? Why is he pouring out his life to me? Because I'm the one person that showed some spiritual concern for him. And he unpackages his heart, and there was a lot of sadness in his life. And he's weeping as he's talking to me. 3 hours. And afterwards I said, Brad, I think you need Jesus in your life. I explained the gospel in about 5 minutes. And he said, you know what, Jerry? I think I need Jesus too. But I don't want to give him my life like it is right now. It's all messed up. I think I'll fix my life first and then I'll give it to him. I said, well, Brad, that's not the way it's usually done. But you can try it that way if you want. If it doesn't work, let me know. Went back to every 3 weeks, telling him I was praying for him, small talk in between. About 5 months after that, I get a phone call at my office. And Brad says, Jerry, my way's not working. Could I come to your office? And he came up, and I led him to Christ that day. I never saw anybody use more Kleenex than that guy did coming to faith. And it says nothing in here that you have to use Kleenex. And he gave his heart to Jesus, and we started doing follow-up. You know what? About 6 years ago, Brad dropped dead of a heart attack. You want to know something else? I'm going to introduce you to him one day, because this stuff matters. And it matters forever. So that's one way. Anybody can pray for people and tell them you're praying for them. There's not a person in here that can say, well, I'm an introvert, and use that as an excuse. On the other hand, I'm an extrovert. And I decided I was going to go reach people for Jesus, but where was I going to reach them? And I thought, I'll go to a donut shop. Yeah, that's a good place. I showed up at 10 o'clock. Who's at donut shops at 10 o'clock? Nobody. Maybe a coffee. You might find a coffee. That's it. If you want to reach people at a donut shop, when do you have to go? Between 6 and 8 in the morning, where people are stopping for their cup of mud and a donut. And so I started going to this Winchell's Donut Shop between 6 and 8 on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I said, Lord, I'm here. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm here. You know, I think a person could write a doctoral dissertation on the sociological protocols of donut shops in America. I had no strategy. I was stupid, but I was willing. Here was my strategy. You're going to laugh your head off. I thought I would go in and I would be reading my Greek Bible. And somebody would come in and say, what's that? And I'd say, it's a Greek New Testament. And they'd say, oh, could I ask Jesus in my heart? That's about as stupid as it was. So I show up at this donut shop, and I noticed every table, little table, you know, some sat 4, some sat 2, they all had people. And the same people every morning, the same people, same place. And when they would come in, I'd say, hi, I'm an extrovert, remember? Hi, good to see you this morning. Wow. That chartreuse sweater, that looks a lot better than that other one you wore the other day. You know, I didn't say that. There's this one guy who'd come in, and he looked like Walter Matthau. Remember Grumpy Old Man? He looked exactly like him, like he'd either been weaned on a dill pickle or baptized in lemon juice. And he comes in, and he always sat at a table right here, and I'd say, hi. And he'd just give me a scowl and go sit down. One day I got caught up reading my Greek Bible. I was praying for the people there. I was reading my Greek Bible, and all of a sudden I hear this voice, can I sit here? And I look up, and it's the grumpy guy. I had him in my prayer list as the grumpy guy. I said, what's your name? He said, Gene. I said, what do you do for a living, Gene? He says, why? You write the book? And I learned something. You don't want to go too deep too quick. That's intrusive. It's not good strategy. I didn't know it at the time. I learned from my mistakes. Remember, I don't have the gift, but I have it as a high value. I want to learn. Well, every Tuesday, Thursday after that, and I looked, by the way, over at his table. Somebody came in the donut shop and didn't know the rules. Somebody had sat at his table. But every Tuesday, Thursday after that, he sat at my table. And you know what I found out about him over time? Twice married, no clue where his former wives were. 2 kids in this world, no clue where his kids were. You ever heard of a deadbeat dad? That was Gene. And God loves deadbeat dads. Some people have to be in their world to reach them. And I happen to be chosen to reach Gene. And it went on for about 9 months. I used to carry a little booklet with me. It was put out by Campus Crusade, written by Phil Wright. It's called Jesus and the Intellectual. It's only about 20 little pages long. Anybody could read it in a half hour. And you'd hand it to somebody and they'd be so flattered. Jesus and the Intellectual. Yeah, Jesus and me. That makes sense. And so one day I gave the booklet to Gene. And he took it. Next time he came, we had small talk. Next time he came, he said to me, "So you think I'm an intellectual, huh?" I said, "You read the book, didn't you?" He said, "Yeah." And we talked that morning, and that morning in the donut shop, Gene gave his heart to Jesus. But I had learned about the pacing of some of this stuff. You can meet a person like Sean, I mentioned this morning, on the airplane, and it goes very fast. Or Hafiz Muhammad, I'll tell you about him in a minute, the limo driver who was a Muslim. I led to Christ in a limo not long ago, and I can share with you how it happened, and it's kind of fun. It's instructive. But nevertheless, with Gene, I learned this. You can ask a public question. It's not intrusive. You listen to the answer. And in the answer, you get information, and with that information, permission to go deeper. One time I was in Chicago, and I met this guy. And I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Peter." I said, "Peter, are you from Chicago?" He's in Chicago. It's not an intrusive question. He said, "No, I grew up in Albuquerque, but when my parents divorced when I was 12, I moved to Chicago with my mother." He didn't have to tell me that stuff. But when he did, it's probably almost like he's been throwing it out there for years because he's got stuff he wants to work through. And nobody picks up on it. "Oh, don't talk about that, my word." And as I started talking to him and asking him questions about it, what if he would have just said, "I grew up in Albuquerque and moved to Chicago when I was 12. There should be plenty to go on there. Do you remember what it was like in your life when you were 12? On the threshold of adolescence, that most purgatorial period of human development? I could have just said, "Wow, you left your basic childhood friends to go process adolescence in Chicago, a place where you've never been before. What was that like?" But he said no, his dad left the family. He came with his mom. And as I talked and asked questions, every question based on the answers that he had given me, and with the answer's permission, I was able to find out that his biggest problem was not the anger he had towards his father, but how the bitterness was so corrosive to him. Remember Anne Lamott in her book, Traveling Mercies, said bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. Mm-hmm. And I know now how to share the gospel with this guy in a way that it will be heard, in a way that the message is relevant. He wants to know how to get rid of bitterness, and the way he's going to be able to learn that is to learn about the forgiveness of God that is so magnanimous. He could not only enter into God's forgiveness himself, but out of the rich reservoir of that forgiveness, he could draw on that with the power to forgive others around him. Okay, so here's another example. Learning again from the mistakes I made with Gene. Don't be afraid of mistakes. If you make a mistake and you realize it, go back and ask forgiveness of that person. And again, you can say to them, "I want to ask your forgiveness. I don't want anything I do to keep you from understanding how deeply you're loved by God." So anyway, I was coming back from Slovakia. I'd given some C.S. Lewis lectures in Bratislava, Slovakia over our spring break in college. The people that had me there for lectures, the schools I lectured there, they brought me back to the Vienna airport. It's only about 45 minutes drive from Slovakia. I get checked in at the gate. I go through passport control, and I come to the gate area. And the gate area is about as big as this room. I'm sitting there waiting for the flight, find out the flight's been delayed 3 hours. I love that. I love the anonymity of airports. I always have a book. It's a chance to read. Pretty soon I see this young woman come into the gate area. She's got a clipboard. She's got a lanyard with a name tag. She's a nice-looking woman. And I see her start talking to people. It's Vienna. It's a German-speaking town. And I can hear her talking German. My assessment is she's probably doing a survey for the airport. And sure enough, a few minutes later, she comes over and she speaks to me in perfect English. And I'm thinking, what am I wearing that gave it away that I'm not German speaking? And she told me she was doing a survey for the airport. And I said, "What's your name?" Public question. She said, "Allegra." I said, "Allegra, are you from Vienna?" She's in Vienna. Public question. She said, "No, I'm from southern Austria." "Oh, what brought you to Vienna?" She said, "I'm a student." "Now, where do you go with that? Where do you go to school? What are you studying?" Every one of those questions brought more and more information. And as the questioning went on, not in an intrusive way, I found out that she had family back in southern Austria. Only actually her father was there. She said, "He lives there, but he's a very bitter man." I said, "Oh, what's he so bitter about?" "Well, my mother left him to go with her lover to Canada." And I said, and I don't blame her either. He's such a toxic person. I said, "It sounds like you've had some struggles with him too." "I have." "Do you have any other family?" "I have a brother." "Where's he?" "Also at the university." "Well, what's your relationship like with him?" "Not very good." And by this time, she says, "And it's worse than that." Now she's giving me information. "It's worse than that." And I said, "Allegra, how's it worse than that?" She said, "My boyfriend said he was going to go study art in Florence, and for me to wait for him. And I dutifully waited for him for 3 months. He came back yesterday to announce to me that he found somebody better in Florence." And this is a woman abandoned, feels unloved. And so I know how to connect the gospel to her felt need. So finally, after 20 minutes, I know her life story, and she hasn't asked me one question on the survey. And I say to her, "Allegra, I know you need to ask her questions, but I have been sent here to tell you something." People, all of us have been sent. Jesus sends us. But then when I said, "I've been sent to tell you something," she thought that I was a spy for the airport to see if she was doing her job. I said, no, it has nothing to do with that. Ask me your question." She goes through the list. How long will it take you to get checked in? How long will it take you to go through passport control? All the things you'd expect. Finally, she said, "What were you sent here to tell me?" I said, "Allegra, the God of the universe knows you. He loves you. Allegra, He loves you. Allegra, sometimes you have to say it 3 times for it to sink in. Allegra, He loves you. And unlike those others in your life, He will not abandon you." She burst into loud sobs. Everybody in that waiting area is looking at me like I'm torturing this poor girl. And she says to me, "But I've done so many wrong things in my life." It's amazing how an awareness of the love of God can allow us to open up our hearts in honesty. And I said, "Allegra, He knows about everyone. And His love is such that He has forgiven you for all of that." How did we get to that place? Asking public questions and listening. Now, I need to say to you, sometimes you'll ask a person public questions and you're having a nice discussion with them and something comes up and they have to go. That's all right. Just the habit of showing that people matter and cultivating the habit of learning to ask questions opens the door for the time when those questions do bring an entry to the gospel with that particular person. There are people in our life all around. I remember one day I was at home. And I said, "Lord, there are people on your radar screen who aren't on mine. They should be because they're in my world." And just as I prayed that, it was a Friday, and I used to be off on Friday, the garbage guy pulls up in front of my house. I said, "I don't feel to go look for that guy. He comes to my house every week. I don't even know his name." I wrote down "garbage guy." The next week, knowing he was coming by about 10 o'clock, that's when he usually came by, I had a glass of iced tea all ready for him. It was a hot part of the year in Chicago. And as soon as I hear the truck coming, I go running out there with the tea. And it was one of those trucks in the days when they would come around behind. There was a basket behind, and throw the trash in the basket. And underneath so many houses, they'd tip it up into the top. He comes around the back, and I'm standing there already. He's kind of surprised to see me. And I said, "You look like you could use a break. Here, you drink the iced tea. I'll throw the trash." Well, now he's looking at me. Who's this guy? What's this? Takes a taste sip. Is it poison or what? And I said to him, "What's your name?" He said, "Mike." He has a name. I erased garbage guy and put Mike in my prayer list. And every week I was out there with something cold to drink in the hot part of the year, something hot to drink in the cold part of the year. One day he came by about noon. And I said, Mike, you're a little bit late today than usual. He said, yeah, I had some troubles on my route. I said, it's about lunchtime. Did you eat lunch yet? He said, no. I said, do you mind if I make you a sandwich? He said, no, that'd be great. He came in the house for a sandwich. I didn't know those guys could do that. And I make him a sandwich. You know what happened? He changed his route and came by at noon every week after that. And every week I'm making him a sandwich. It was in that context we got to talk more deeply. You know what his story was? He grew up in a neighborhood where there was a woman who lived in that neighborhood who was a lover of the children of that neighborhood and decided to have a backyard Bible club for the kids in that neighborhood. Did you do that? And he came to the club, and he remembered praying the prayer when he was an 8-year-old boy, and 2 weeks later his family moved away, and he was never followed up. And that woman who loved those kids, who probably prayed for Mike as a boy, never got to hear the end of the story. And now all of a sudden I'm able to follow him up, and we start doing follow-up, and he starts growing. He and his wife start going to church, and their kids came to faith, and then he got traded off the route, and I had a new garbage guy in. And there was the mailman, Steve. He comes to my house every day. What do you do if you see the mailman come to your house? I always say to him, you need to use the bathroom. Jesus said a cup of cold water could do the trick. Sometimes just a simple act of human kindness opens up doors. Would you like to use the bathroom? And eventually I got to know Steve pretty well, and I was able to share the gospel with Steve, and he trusted Christ. I said, Steve, you ought to come to church with me on Sunday. He says, Jerry, it's kind of hard for me. I'm divorced, and I have the kids on the weekend, and I think it'd be tough. I said, you got to bring them to my church. They'll love it. Our church has great stuff for kids. Sure enough, I said, come over for dinner afterwards. And so sure enough, he came, and he brought his kids, and they came over, and I was able to lead both of his kids to Jesus after that dinner that day. My mailman, Phil, he'll use the bathroom once in a while, and sometimes on a really cold day, he'll say, well, do you have something hot to drink? Or on a really hot day of the year, he'll say, do you have something really cold to drink? Or something like that. I haven't been able to get in to Phil like I was able to with Steve, but he's in my world, and if he's in my world, he matters. And God has brought him there, and my circumstances are going to turn out for the greater progress of the gospel. See what I'm saying? Now, sometimes we have people, I think there's 3 levels that we can share our faith. One is what I call contact evangelism. You just go out sharing your faith. Sometimes I go out with students at Wheaton College. We'll take the commuter train into Chicago. We come to the Alderwood Transportation Center. We go to the food court. People are sitting around there. They're either waiting for their train or they're waiting for somebody to pick them up. And if I do contact evangelism, I just don't go around and stand around. I make known what I'm doing. It's sort of like Paul in the Agora in Acts 17, or like Jesus with the woman at the well in John 4. And I just go to them and I say, I'm here with some students. I'm a professor at Wheaton College, and we're here talking to people about Jesus. Do you mind if we talk with you? 17 out of 20 will talk with us. I've never seen it easier to talk to people about Jesus than now. Why is that? I think one, as Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they find their rest in Him. And there's a lot of restless hearts going on. And if a person isn't in church, where do they process this stuff? The media has shut out religious interest. Do you know the name David Brooks, the New York Times journalist? He came to speak at Wheaton College one time, and he said, you know, if a journalist is in Iowa after a tornado, they'll ask the farmer who just lost his farm, how are you processing this and getting by? And the farmer will say, if I didn't have my faith in Jesus, I wouldn't be getting by. And he says, yeah, I know, but how are you getting by? And they don't even hear it coming in, and Brooks says that they won't hear it going out. In a secular society, where does a person process the percolating in the heart? And if you go make yourself available, sometimes those conversations open up. I was there one time, it was in September, a year ago, and I walked up to this man and I said, my name's Jerry Root, we're talking to people about Jesus, do you mind if we talk to you? And he says, I'm not interested, I'm Jewish. I said, that's how Jesus started out. And he started laughing, so whatever I am, it's not going to be that cumbersome of a conversation. And so he laughs, and he says, listen, you're not going to get through to me. This is my high holy day, and I'm Orthodox. I said, what high holy day is it? He says, it's Yom Kippur. I said, oh, the Day of Atonement. Do you believe your sins can be atoned for? He says, listen, you're not going to get through to me. I said, I'm not going to change, he said. I said, oh, yeah, you are, because you already have. He said, what do you mean? I said, this is a Friday, and it's Yom Kippur, and you're here at the train station rather than in the temple. You've already changed something. And he said, you're right. I said, what's your name? He said, Daniel. I said, Daniel means God is my judge. And we started talking. I said, Daniel, you live here in Chicago? Yeah, there's the public questions. We started talking. Finally, I got to the place of the public questions to find out he was a playwright in Chicago. And I said, tell me what makes for a good play. He says, well, you got to have tension. There's got to be a crisis of some sort. There's got to be people trying to approach that crisis in different ways, some successful and some unsuccessful. And the more human it is, the better the play. And all of a sudden that opened the door to talk about all the human complexity and sadnesses and sorrows in our world. And I was able to share the gospel in light of what he was trying to do as a playwright. You ask the questions, you find out, you listen, and so forth. 20 minutes into the conversation, he says, you know what, this has been a great conversation. I got to go catch my train. I said, Daniel, what's your middle name? He said, Joshua. I said, Joshua means God is my salvation. Your name is the gospel. Daniel, God is my judge, but God is my salvation. And he goes, I never thought about that. And he goes off the train. Who knows what happened to him? Maybe we'll find out later. These things are a lot of fun. And you can have fun. And I'm supposed to have a Q&A time, right? So I'll do one more story. I got thousands of them. And I want to multiply the stories because you can have thousands of them too. And if you make mistakes, don't let that bother you. If it doesn't go well, don't let that bother you. God's at work. Actually, I'm going to tell two quick stories. One of them, in college, I led this guy to Christ. He became captain of the wrestling team. We roomed together all through college and went to seminary together. He holds a school record still to this day, most pins in a season. When we were juniors, 2 freshmen came to the wrestling team, and we shared Jesus with them. When they found out we were Christians, they were making fun of us and all this stuff. And it wasn't too threatening to us. We'd just whoop them on the mat. We were older, no problem. But we made no progress with those guys, and those guys were constantly ragging on us. A few years back, I got a phone call from my office at Wheaton College. This guy says, Jerry, this is a voice from your past. I said, yeah, who is it? He says, it's Joe, one of those wrestlers. I said, Joe, did you ask Jesus in your heart yet? First question I asked him. He said, I did. 2 years after he graduated, he got a job at Morgan Stanley in Los Angeles. Somebody took him to a Christian businessman's club. A Christian who saw his circumstances are for the greater progress of the gospel. Took Joe to the Christian businessman's club. Joe gave his heart to Jesus. He got followed up in the Navigator Discipleship Program. He started leading people to Jesus. And he said just a couple weeks ago, I was at a Christian businessman's meeting, and somebody said, there was somebody who was a link in your coming to Christ who never heard the end of the story. So consequently, I called around, and when somebody said, you went there, I kept calling until I found you. It took me 3 days to find you. I want you to know, all the times you shared with me, it was not for naught. And I said, what about your buddy Ken? He said, he became a Christian too. He's a medical doctor in Denver, and he works with the youth group of the church. Is that cool or not? Those things are out there. You may not always hear the end of the story. One day you will when we get to heaven. Be faithful. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain. Now, this is the last story before the Q&A. When I was a kid in high school, I got involved in youth and government through the YMCA. I was kind of interested in politics. That's how that student government thing worked. And I didn't. None of the threads went right in the fabric. But I was told that I could go work for Ronald Reagan's campaign when he ran for favorite son candidate in 1968, the year Nixon was nominated. So I went to the Miami convention. I had met him 3 times in his office when he was governor of California for student government stuff. One time it was just Reagan and one other guy and me in his office. Another time it was Reagan and 2 other guys and me. Another time it was 8 of us in his office. But I'd met him a few times, and I'd go work on his campaign. And I
I probably met him 35 times in Miami while I was working on his campaign there. I come back, I become a Christian. And the guys that led me to Christ, they would go to all the riots and protests and share Jesus with people. And there was going to be a big riot at UCLA. And the Board of Regents were going to raise the tuition. And students came from UC San Diego, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara. And there were thousands of kids at UCLA's campus. They were going to let 40 students into the Board of Regents meeting. My roommates and I didn't go to one of the UC schools, but we were one of the 40 students who got into the meeting. They handed us the agenda. And on the agenda, about a third of the way down, it says, discuss the tuition hike for the UC schools. And right underneath it, it says, time for student comment. As soon as the Board of Regents come in, we're sitting in chairs here. As soon as the Board of Regents come in and go over there to the front, the students start screaming and throwing chairs like this across the room. Screaming obscenities. I'm going, what is going on? The moderator gets up and says, listen, we want you students in this meeting. We want to hear from you. You've got the agenda. We've got a lot of other things to discuss. When we get to the tuition raise, you can see it's right there. We want to hear from you. But if you disrupt this meeting again, you're going to have to leave. And the students started throwing the chairs across the room, screaming obscenities again. Finally, the moderator says, you're out. There was a hallway that went that way. Instead of going down the hallway, I saw the Regents go out a door there. I went through a door there. As soon as I got through the door, there's Governor Reagan about as close as you are to me. I said, Governor Reagan, I don't know if you remember or not, man, sure I worked in the campaign in Miami in Miami, and since that time I've become a Christian. I'm here at the Butcher Campus Community Christ people, and we're sharing the gospel with the protesters. Have you ever heard of the 4 spiritual laws? I had to say it fast, but I knew I had to get back in this meeting. He puts his arm around my shoulder. And he says, you know what, Jerry, I didn't remember your name, but I definitely remember your face. I don't know if that was good news. And he said, you know, I came back from Miami so discouraged. And I went to my pastor, Don Moomow, at Bel Air Presbyterian Church. And Don Moomow led me to Christ at that time. And next month, I'm going up to Arrowhead Springs for a weekend of Bible studies with Bill Bright. But listen, I've got to get back into this meeting. How about if you share the 4 laws of 3 of my aides? And he put me in a side room from the room where I had talked with him, and the Regents were going over there. And I went in that side room, and I'm sharing the 4 laws of 3 of his aides. My roommates got outside, and my roommate said it was amazing, because outside, these protesters got on the bullhorn and said they wouldn't allow free speech in there. They didn't say, we disrupted your opportunity to have a representative in that meeting. They put the onus on somebody else. And so the students went into a rage. They tried to break into the building. There were law enforcement people there. They're pounding on the walls of the building. And I'm sharing the 4 laws, and there's a transom in that room. No windows, but a transom. All of a sudden, beer bottles are coming through, rocks are coming through, glass is breaking on the ground. And I'm saying, and Law 2 says, man is sinful. It's I get through the 4 laws. 2 of the guys got up like they could have done something. One guy sat through the whole thing. He didn't trust Christ, but he says, I want to find out more about this. I'll go with the governor when he goes to Arrowhead Springs. And just then I walk out of that room. And there's a live newscast at this end of the room. The lights are on. I can hear the reporter. And he says, we do know there was one student who was able to talk to the governor. And the lights and camera people were going like that. He turns around and looks. There he is! And he goes running over to where I'm at. And he says, what was it you said to the governor? And I started talking to him about Jesus on the live newscast. And the guy wanted to kink the hose. Is that fun? It doesn't always go well. If you're afraid of striking out, don't play baseball. But if you don't play baseball, you'll never know the joy of hitting a home run. Learn from your mistakes. Pray. Grow. And do what God wants you to do where He's planted you in this world. Any questions? Yes, sir. First name. If you grew a white beard, you'd be really handsome. Say it again.
I've heard that before.
What before? Oh yeah, I told you this morning. Every time I meet a bald guy with white hair who's on his way towards really being handsome, I want to encourage you. Anyway, tell me your first name.
Dana.
Dana.
Yeah. What about the Muslim taxi driver?
Oh, the Muslim, you want to hear that one?
Yes, yes.
In the C.S. Lewis seminar?
Yes.
You guys mind hearing it again?
Sure.
Okay, so Wheaton College contracts with the limo service. So faculty members or administrators and stuff need to go to the airport and go back, they pick us up. And I was getting picked up at the airport from this limo driver, and he says, I see I'm taking you to Wheaton College. What do you do there? I said, I'm a professor. He said, what are you a professor of? And I said, well, my degree is in philosophy of religion. My doctorate's in philosophy of religion. He goes, what religion are you? I said, I'm a Christian. How about you? He said, I'm a Muslim. We get in the limo, and he says, what's the difference between Islam and Christianity? And I said, I've read about 2/5 of the Quran, maybe half of it. I haven't read the whole thing, so I'll defer to you on matters of the Quran. But I know my Bible fairly well. And I said, first off, no Christian believes that God came down and cohabited with a woman and produced Jesus. No Muslim academic believes we believe that. But a lot of times on the popular level, the Muslims think that we think that as Christians. You got to get that off the table because they think we're wackos. He said, really? I said, I don't know one who believes that. I said, number 2, Surah 3 and Surah 6 says that you don't believe in the God of the Trinity. And I said, so consequently, I want to say to you that we Christians do believe in God of Trinity. One God eternally exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think I can explain to you how it works. He said, yeah, how's that? I said, do you believe God's a contingent being or a non-contingent being? And he said, what do you mean by contingent being? So I explained, he's either self-existent and necessary being with no causation, or he's a cause being. Oh, no, we believe he's non-contingent. Second, do you believe God's a God of love? And he said, yes. I've had this conversation with no less than 200 Muslims, and all of them say they believe God's a God of love. You'd expect them to say he's a God of justice, or a God of mercy, or God is good, but they all say he's a God of love. I said, okay, second question, or third question, who's the object of his love? And he said, we are creationists. I said, if God needs creation to fulfill his nature, you've got a contradiction in your theology. Because relational attributes in a non-contingent being presuppose that relationship must be necessary in that being. He said, I'm tracking with you. No less than 18 times in this conversation, he said, I'm tracking with you. And I said, the reason why this thing about God's love is so important to us is because it's at the heart of our faith. And I said, for example, C.S. Lewis said, if you're a Christian, you don't have to believe everything about the other religions is necessarily false. But where Christianity and the other religions differ, you have to believe Christianity is true. Here are 3 things where we all agree, all the major religions. And I'm quoting from Rudolf Otto's idea of the holy. I said, all the great world religions believe in a divine essence. They name it differently if they're an animist, a pantheist, a polytheist, a dualist, a monotheist, or a monotheistic Trinitarian. They believe in some transcendent other. Otto calls it the numinous. Second, all the great world religions believe there's a moral code that people fail to keep. Third, all the great world religions believe that the divine essence is a custodian of the moral code, and if we have failed to keep the moral code, we've offended the divine essence. He said, I'm tracking with you. He said, I believe in the supernatural. I believe in hell, and I don't want to go there. He says, I'm doing the best I know how to keep from going there. I said, Hafiz, how's it going? Do you believe God's a perfect being? How's it going? He said, I live in fear. I said, Hafiz, you don't need to live in fear anymore. You see, where Christianity is different is that we believe this God loves us so much that what we couldn't do to fix ourselves, he fixed for us in Christ. When Christ died on the cross and rose again, and somehow his death and resurrection sets us right with God. He said, I'm tracking with you. I said, Hafiz, is there any reason why you wouldn't want to trust Christ right now? Never be afraid to ask that question. Is there any reason why you wouldn't want to trust Christ right now? He said, none. And he prayed to trust Christ with me right there out loud in that moment. So then I said, do you have a Bible? He said, no. I said, well, let me get you a Bible. And he said, you know what, it would help me if you could get me a Bible on CD, because I'm in the car all the time. So I was able to get him the Bible, I was able to do some follow-up material with him, and it was really a lot of fun. So that's the Muslim. Okay. Yes? I've got a Buddhist and a Hindu too, but that's yes?
Did you hear Ron Reagan Jr. say that he was an atheist and he had no fear of going to hell?
I didn't hear him say that, but it's a tragic statement. But you heard him, so you should pray for him.
Oh, he did it in a commercial during a Democratic debate
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago.
It's a foolish statement. And it's a foolish statement. I'm not saying he's a fool, but it's a foolish statement because if he could define what hell was, and if he believes that he's going to be an atheist and he doesn't care if he goes to hell, I think that he has reduced the gravity of these things that he's saying. It's very sad. There are no atheists. There are none. What is the claim of an atheist? An atheist says there's no possibility God exists. Every time I meet an atheist, I just say to them, well, there's 19 million volumes under one roof at the Widener Library at Harvard University. What did you think when you read all those books? I said, I didn't read those books. And I said, but you're making a claim that there's no possibility that God exists. And you're making this universal claim, and there's all kinds of things out there you don't know that might come against your view. Give me an honest agnostic anyway, not a dishonest atheist. I talked with Madeline Marie O'Hara, do you remember her? I talked with her for almost an hour, just one-on-one with her. And she was very clear to me. She wasn't an atheist for philosophical, theological reasons. She was an atheist because she said, I'm very promiscuous. I choose to be promiscuous. And if I were to become a Christian, it would count against the lifestyle I'm choosing for myself.
Didn't she become a Christian?
No, her son did. And her son became a Christian, became a pastor, and became a Christian apologist. It's interesting. And God never stopped loving Madeline Marie O'Hara. He loves her. You had a question, sir. You told me your name before too, and I'm so sorry.
Ingolf.
That's right.
Good Norwegian.
Yeah,
Viking.
Norwegian. That's right.
I believe you are here by God's divine appointment. This church is poised to impact the city of Lynnwood as never before,
Yeah.
with a legacy of compassion. Next door, a 3-story commercial building has just been bought. First of the year, we're going to move in a food bank, clothes, Union Gospel Mission, other things to impact people.
Wow.
You're sharing today and tonight, very practical, on the level where we itch and you scratch.
Wow.
And I thank God you're here. What are 3 things this church could do next door in a practical way to reach Lynnwood for Christ?
Well, find out what the needs are of the community.
Yes.
Go ahead and enter into those needs, but never let the gospel drop out.
Correct.
So when I first got there, a lot of people were saying that it's a dichotomy. Which wing? What's more important, social justice or the gospel message? And I said that's like asking which wing of the airplane is more important, the right one or the left one. Don't let the gospel drop out. My background, I'm an evangelical Quaker. I'm a 5-point Calvinist Quaker. I think I'm the only one in the world, so I'm probably wrong. But nevertheless, the Quakers, when they started out, were remarkable at this. They were the great movers and shakers in abolition. They were the great movers and shakers in child labor laws, because people were sending their kids off to work in factories at 6 and 8 years old, putting in 12-hour days. They were the great ones in stopping them. They were the great ones in prison reform, Elizabeth Fry, and so on. They did so many great things. And they believed that the Holy Spirit gave them a prompting. And if they asked God to fill them with their Holy Spirit, they would get the prompts, they would follow the prompts. God gives us prompts economically, you follow the prompt, and you get more prompts. That was all good. They called that prompting of the Holy Spirit the inner light. And some Quakers began to think because they had the inner light, they didn't need the scriptures anymore. And it wasn't long after that before they had all the social action and all the biblical responsibility drifted away. Keep the balance between the two.
Yeah.
That's so important. And find out what the needs are in your community. Every community is unique. Find out what the needs are in your community. I know it's a pretty mono-ethnic here. And maybe you're in a community that's not necessarily mono-ethnic. There's other people here besides Norwegians, I'm sure.
Amen.
I don't know if there's
Heaven
any
is
Swedes
going to
here.
be
A friend
full
of
of all kinds of people.
A friend of mine told me, you know why Jesus couldn't be born in Norway? They couldn't find any wise men to the east. It's terrible. That joke will get you nowhere as far as Jesus. But I think you need to say, who's in our community? And if there are people of ethnic diversity, reach them. If you're in a community, who's from Nebraska? I met somebody from Nebraska. If you're from Nebraska, some farm town out in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska, you don't have to feel guilty that you don't have diversity at your church. And the reason why is because there's probably, you'd have to bus them in from 300 miles away.
Yeah.
But there's a church, my wife grew up in a Dutch Reformed church. Her grandfather used to pastor the church and preached in Dutch. He felt they needed to reach out to the community. The Queen of Holland came to hear him preach. There's a picture of my wife when she was 3 years old handing a bouquet of flowers to Queen Wilhelmina Wilhelmina of Holland. He started preaching in English because he wanted to reach the community. Well, in time, and when I met Claudia, most of that church were immigrants, and they had Dutch accents and so on. But in time, that neighborhood changed. And the urbanization moved into the suburbs. And the white flight, all these churches left. And the pastor of that church called it the deministerized zone. And he said, we're going to reach people in this community. And you started having people who were in houses where there might have been 3 families living in that house, working multiple shifts at minimum wage jobs, like at the Taco Bell and the McDonald's and stuff. And the houses would get disheveled and in disarray. And so that church said they would go to the people in those houses. They didn't know if they were illegals or legals. It didn't make any difference. They were in their community, so they were the ones that were sent to them by God. And they'd go to the house and they'd say, listen, we're from the church down the street here. We want to know if we could roof your house for you, paint your house, put on new shutters, landscape your yard. You couldn't keep people from that church. And not only that, they said, if these people are going to come to our church, we need to have a staff that looks like the people who come through the front door. So they started hiring people of diversity. It wasn't long after that, they were sending 250 people out every weekend to do this work in homes. And then they're right next to Compton. So they started partnering with churches in Compton, it's a rough part of LA. And all of a sudden, Rick Warren heard about it at Saddleback, and he said, we're sending people your way. They send out 1,000 every weekend to work in churches in those neighborhoods. And what do you do then? You got to have a culture in that church that looks like the culture around. And these were Dutch surfers who liked the Beach Boys. You've got now blacks and Hispanics, and they actually had, and they had people who said, if it's not Isaac Watts, I'm not singing it. And you actually have a music sound now at that church that sounds like Beach Boys, Isaac Watts, salsa, soul. And the people love it because it's their culture at that church. That church is now the largest Reformed church in America because they didn't leave the community and they said, what do the people look like in this community? That's who we're going to become. We're going to reach them. So it's a wonderful story. Nobody at that church is a writer. The story should be told. But they're too much activists, and they're making a difference, and they're discipling people, and it's just exciting, really exciting, and that's what's going to happen here. But Claudia and I both said if we lived here, we'd go to this church. We were so moved by it. Somebody had a hand up back there. First name?
That's Stacy.
Huh?
Stacy.
Stacy.
I was just wondering, what's the best approach to witness to someone that you love in your family that's dabbling in the occult, the supernatural, they think they're very spiritual, and they don't need Jesus?
Yeah. You got to discern, if you can, is this a spiritual quest and they're hungry, or is this a spiritual excuse and they're looking for rationalization of bad behavior? Paul says we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, Romans 1:18. And C.S. Lewis wrote, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Aristotle coined a phrase for it. He called it akrasia or akrasia. In Greek, it means to be without command of your moral life because you've rationalized your bad behavior. If that's it, you just got to pray that God somehow breaks through the veneer. If they're spiritually hungry, ask them about their spiritual hunger. Tell me about this. You could even begin with the most positive approach. You seem to be a person who's spiritually hungry. Tell me about that hunger. And listen to them. And then as they tell their story, you can ask them, how's that working for you? And then you begin to find out. And a lot of times if they're in ascendancy, you talk to some young person, a college student who thinks that this boyfriend or this girlfriend is going to do it for them. And if they're in ascendancy, you're not going to get to them. But when all of a sudden they find out that relationship wasn't going to do it for them, and they're in the descent, a lot of times you can be there because you were loving them and stay close to them, be there to catch them at that time. So I think if you could discern, that might help. I don't want to give you one size fits all, but that's the approach. Okay, how are we doing? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, first name?
My name is Rochelle.
Rochelle?
What advice do you have for sharing the gospel with?
I have to wear hearing aids and I can't hear even with them in.
What advice do you have for sharing the gospel with a homosexual person or LGBTQ?
Mm-hmm. Well, one, you need to love them, but you don't need to sell the farm. And what's happened, I think, in the church, we've not done well with this issue. There is no medical proof that this is a genetic thing. And the gay lobby is very bright. They're very clever. And they have thought that if we could somehow make this look like a genetic thing, then people can't condemn our behavior. And I think it's behavioral. I'll explain it to you in just a minute. So I was just talking to a medical doctor who's been doing a lot of research on this. He says there's three things they did that they'll appeal to, but none of those three tests that they've done have ever been able to be reduplicated. So if it has scientific credit, it should be able to be reduplicated over and over again. Water boils at 212 degrees at sea level. You can do it anywhere in the world and that'll happen. So they got it moved out of DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, after the second edition, that it's not any kind of disorder. That was smart on their part. And then they began to say, you can't speak out against this because it's a genetic proclivity and therefore this is a civil right. But if that's the case, if this is genetic, the numbers should be diminishing, not increasing, because they don't reproduce. So why is the number increasing? We've had #MeToo because of abuse of men towards women. If this is increasing because people are becoming predators, that's not good. Not all in that category are predators. Some are monogamous. That's a whole different breed of cat. And I don't put all the people who are in this category in the same exact category. We have to look at it discerningly, I think. And we have to look at it lovingly, but again, not selling the farm. Do you know how many women the average man in America has slept with in a lifetime? 7. Do you know how many trysts the average gay man has had in a lifetime with other men? 170. This is not normative behavior. This is orgasmic. This is a drug. Mm-hmm. Do I demean the drug addict? No. I want to love the drug addict. Do I demean the alcoholic? No. I want to love the alcoholic, but I don't give them drugs and alcohol. And what we've done is we've condoned the behavior. If in fact this was genetic and this person said, I just want to live a life and express my own sexuality in a way that any heterosexual would, we wouldn't think it was good behavior for a heterosexual to have sex with 170 different people in a lifetime. We would say, really, the way you should be learning these things is through virtue. Virtue expresses itself with courage, temperance, justice, doesn't want to hurt another person, and wisdom. And instead, this group is looking for an excuse for behavior, and it's behavior probably, just like the alcoholic and the drug addict. Alcoholic and drug addict is anesthetizing deep woundedness. If there's deep woundedness in the person who is in that community, I want to have my heart break for the woundedness. And I want them to find the only way they can find ultimate solution, which is in Christ. But it's not going to be found when the church says, well, we think this is okay. Or I have a friend who has this struggle, and therefore I think it's compassionate and tolerant for me to go ahead and encourage that behavior. That's not helping them. That's putting them in the vortex where they're using artificial ways to deaden the pain. Our wounds are deeper than our convictions. And people will throw out convictions to salve the wound until they can find out that Jesus can heal the wound at that place. So I'm not in any way trying to minimize the complexity, but I do think a lot of Christians are going about this in the wrong way. So when I talk to the person who is struggling with these things, I say, tell me your story. Now, the first guy I ever spent a lot of time with who was gay was back in the 1970s, probably 1976 or 7. And he was working in Hollywood. He was a dancer, and he was a commercial producer. He grew up in the church where I was a college pastor. And I met him, it was either an Easter, a Thanksgiving, or Christmas break. His name was Randy. And we got to talking in the lobby of the church. And I found out the family he came from and so on. And he told me right away he was gay. And I said, well, let's start getting together. So we started meeting. He would come out to the suburbs every other week, and I would go into Hollywood every other week with him. He was living with these old men who were preying upon him, very, very wealthy men. They were giving him work for favors. And he says, I don't know if I'm getting my work because my work is good, or if I'm getting my work because I'm giving these old men sex. He had a lot of doubts. He had a father who didn't understand him, who thought something was wrong with him because he loved to dance. And consequently, there was conflict. He had a father vacuum. I think there were a lot of complex things. And we met together for probably a year and a half. He's the first guy I ever knew who died of AIDS. It just broke my heart. Years ago, I had a woman come to me. She had been in my college ministry in Wheaton years before. And I was speaking at a Christian conference center called Forest Home in LA. And she came up to me and she married a guy who was a psychologist at Cambridge University. And she said, Jerry, I've got to talk with you. I have a son and I'm worried he might be a transvestite. He's 8 years old. And I said, why do you have this worry? And she said, because he always gets in my closet and he's always feeling my clothes. And he's always putting on my clothes. And I said, and so you think he might be a transvestite? Because the scriptures seem to indicate to me that that's not a reality. So consequently, there might be other reasons for this. Why do you immediately go to the worst possible explanation? What if he loves color? What if you've got a son who has an aesthetic eye and he loves beauty? Why don't you celebrate this? And matter of fact, tell him, I want you to go with me. You seem to have a good eye for color and design. I want you to go with me and pick out 2 dresses for me. And 2 outfits. And I say, and if he picks them out, you wear them. And don't be surprised, they're probably really going to be good, because he probably has a good eye. So anyway, I didn't see her for a couple of years. Next time I saw her, I said, how'd it go with your son? I said, it was amazing. I took him shopping, just like you said. He picked these great outfits. They're still my favorite outfits ever. And I said, and how's he doing? He says he's out roughhousing with all of his boys and his friends and so on, but he also feels like he can celebrate beauty. He can celebrate these kinds of things. What's the outlet for a little boy who's 7, 8, 9, who plays war all the time and so on? What's his outlet for this? And because she was able to assume the best, not the worst, she projects the best onto it, and she is able to fan the embers of this thing into a flame, and this boy is firing on more cylinders than the average boy. And I think we have to be thinking about these sorts of things. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but I do think that there are ways we can love these folks. Don't sell the farm, because I don't think that loves them. But I do think you can love them, and you must love them. It's not an option. But love them in a way that will bring them to a loving solution to whatever's going on inside of them. And there's some goofy stuff. Do you guys know about the Folsom Street Fair in San Francisco? The last weekend of September, every year, there's anywhere from 350 to 500,000 homosexuals out on the streets of San Francisco naked having an orgy. You don't even read about it. Google it. But if you Google it, have somebody else in the room with you so you don't get caught in the vortex of looking at that. And it's incredible. That's not normative behavior. And it doesn't even make it into the papers, because I think people know if you had 500,000 heterosexuals having an orgy on the street someplace in the world, that would make it into all the papers. This is there. It goes on. And people just look past it or suppress it, because I think they know it would be bad politics for their movement. So anyway, these are my impressions. They're probably somewhat, some percentage good, some percentage bad, but you can run with it. Is that fair? Does it sound okay? All right. And I don't know how much longer we should go.
Do one more question.
Yes, first name?
Trent.
Trent.
So my wife actually just texted me and a question popped in my head. We live in a neighborhood with a lot of ethnicity, so a lot of mainly Hindu people around us. And I guess today is a very large Hindu holiday. So, we try to love our neighbors and be there side by side with them. But she asked me how, maybe we should have brought them gifts or something for this holiday. And it struck me, how does that fit into evangelism, other religious holidays, and still loving and accepting?
Luke 16:9, make friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may welcome you into the eternal dwellings. Go ahead and give people gifts. Love them. Give them gifts not that you would like to receive, but give them the gifts that you're knowing them well enough, they would like to receive. And if it's one of their holidays, say, hey, I know this is a big holiday for you. Brought this over for you. And blessings. And the holidays over, we'd love to have you over for those. When you make friends with your needs, in order that you might have access to their heart. And when the gifts fail, maybe by then you led them to Christ, and when you get to heaven, when they come, they'll say, hey, remember those gifts you gave us years ago. The other thing too, most of the religions, especially among the ardent followers who are sincere, they have those three things that Rudolph Otto talks about. And when they get to the place where they realize that they are at odds with the divinity because of some shortcoming in their life, there's usually a fear factor there. One time I was at college in DuPage, I was a teacher for 10 years, philosophy, C.S. I was walking through the cafeteria and I saw this woman with a book open. And the print on this book looked different than anything I'd ever seen. I know print from the Orient, and I know print from Hebrew and Greek and Arabic, but I'd never seen anything like this before. So as I passed by, I said to the woman who was reading, please forgive me, I don't mean to disturb you, but I'm curious as all get out. What's that print in that book? She says, oh, I'm a Hindu, and this is a Hindu devotional, and this is Sanskrit. I said, wow, you're a Hindu. Do you mind if I ask you questions about your Hinduism? And she said, no, that's fine. And I said, well, for example, what do you believe happens to you after you die? She says, oh, we're different than you Westerners. We cremate our dead. I said, no, I'm not asking you how you dispose of human remains. What happens to you after you die? She said, well, we believe in millions of gods. And they watch everything you do, and everything you say, and everything you think. And if you do well, they will let you come back in a higher state. If you do poorly, her word, you come back a dog or a cat. I said, you believe that there are millions of gods watching everything you do and say, and if you do anything wrong, they're going to hold that against you? She said, yeah. I said, that is scary. She said, we live in fear. I said, do you believe in the Christian God? She says, we believe in every God. We believe Jesus is God. We believe in every God. I said to her, he said, you don't have to be afraid. She said, I know. He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. I said, how did you know that? He said, I saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ. There's all kinds of clues in the culture. The C.S. Lewis thing yesterday, you guys record that? But there's a lot of stuff in the culture you can begin to draw on to help. But she lived in fear, and I was able to pick up on that she knew that line. And that line, she was holding on to, because it gave her a modicum of hope, and we could develop a little further with her. Is that fair? Okay. Thank you very much. What time is it?
7:45. Would you pray for us?
Yeah, I will. I just have to catch an airplane. If I'm not in class tomorrow, I'm cooked. I might be coming here as one of the people who needs to use your All right. Gracious Heavenly Father, I worship you for the kindness of these people towards Claudia and me. I worship you for the vibrancy of this fellowship. I worship you for the content of the words of the songs we sang in the worship and how each one blended together sort of a unity with the overall approach of the worship. I worship you for the opportunity to talk one-on-one with so many people in this congregation, both yesterday and today between the services and so forth. I celebrate with you, Father, the vibrancy, the obvious presence of the Holy Spirit in this midst. I worship you for the pastoral leadership of this church and for the way they've encouraged the people of this church. I worship you for the good news I just heard about what this church is planning to do to extend their outreach. I pray that you would use the things that we talked about this evening to help each person here feel like they don't have to be developing a big show. They can just be concerned with the person that you have brought into their immediate influence. And enable them, Father, each one to pray for, to nurture, to encourage, to ask those public questions, to listen, and to be able to go from the listening to deeper questions until they find the place where the gospel can touch the heart of each person here. Father, I celebrate this place and I pray that you said in Philippians 1, he who began a good work in you will continue until the day of Christ Jesus. I pray the good work that you've begun here, you would cause the flames to just build up more and more and more, and that it would consume with the gospel this whole region, and that this church would be faithful to the calling